All right, sounds good. And a shout out to all my Star Wars fans in the audience. This is accessible images when it matters most. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, DrupalCon, for letting me come here today and talk about how to make images more accessible. My name is Carrie Fisher. I work for a company called DQ. I'm a senior accessibility consultant and trainer. You can find my email right there, Twitter, LinkedIn, Drupal, and GitHub if you want to connect with me later. Before I worked in accessibility, I did work in and organizations in the Drupal community as a front-end developer. And so I've kind of been around since about maybe like Drupal 4 or 5. So it's been a long, strange trip for sure. All right, so let's get into it. When it comes to informing the public about critical health issues, timing is everything. The information you consume today could literally save your life tomorrow. And with more than 65% of the population being visual learners, meaning they learn and remember best through visual communication, the job of creating and sharing accessible images has never been more important. This is especially true, obviously, today, 2020. A lot of public service announcements, we call them PSAs, aimed at providing crucial and urgent information to the public, regardless of the topic. But what happens when your users have visual impairments? Or what about dyslexia or cognitive disorders? How do people with these disabilities receive and understand this visual information? So what elements make an image accessible or inaccessible? That's some of the things that we hope to cover today. So to help you produce more accessible images, we're going to go over some different types of images and their corresponding message. This is also called alternative text, or you may have heard of it as alt. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. We're going to dive into some real world examples in accessible images and discuss which elements matter most when critical message needs to reach everyone. So another big group is color and contrast. Another one we'll talk about is typography and layout and copy and icons. So for all you front-end developers, you definitely will understand and have applicable takeaways, hopefully, from the image types and alts, which is about 40% of the presentation. But don't forget the other 3 that are coming, because even if you're not specifically the person creating that, somebody on your team is, and somebody you will be implementing some of those things as well into your website, your app, your PSA, your PDF, your email, right? Anything really digital. Accessibility runs the gamut of any kind of product. All right, so it's early here, but I'm already excited to talk about the different types of images and how to produce alternative information for your images for your users. First up, the World Health Organization estimates there are about 39 million people who are blind and about 246 million people with low vision worldwide. So that's a total of 285 million, if you're keeping track here with the math, who might be using an assistive technology device like a screen reader to understand your image. So this is a huge piece of your audience you're forgetting about if you don't think about your image alts. But before we get into the methods of how the message will be delivered, we need to take a step back and think about the why of the image. So first, the question I'm asking is, what is the purpose of your image? And these are things that I'm thinking about in my head. This is called an image alt description tree. So it kind of gives you a workflow or a thought process of what you're going to do with your images and how the alt is going to be added or not added to your image. So the first question I ask myself is, what is the purpose? Is it to enrich the experience, or is it to inform my audience or my user? So again, you can think of it as, is it decorative or is it informative? Does it give information? If it's informative, the next question I ask myself is, what is the next step? What do I want my user to do? Do I want them to take an action, or do I want them to just get a message? And if it is a message, what type of message am I asking or giving? And is it a simple, is it complex, or is it emotional? And that last one is one that a lot of people forget about because they think of it as not necessary, especially, unfortunately, some of us developers, we don't understand some of that messaging. Maybe that's coming from marketing or design that's thinking about that piece of it, but which is critical to the message. So using a tool like this, or there's a lot of different image alt tree decisions, trees that are out there. WCAG has one and other organizations have them. So you can Google that quick and get one of your own, or you can just, you know, screenshot this or take this slide after, and it can help you process the image. Or if decision trees are not your thing, you could just imagine that your image has just vanished. And then you ask yourself, do I understand the content that remains? If the answer is yes, the image is decorative. If it's not, the image is informative and contextually necessary. All right, so we're going to take a look at a a decorative image. So in this example, we see a giant letter S and a drawing of a black cat with green eyes. And this is used to accentuate the drop cap look of the Smashing Magazine article here. So when we remove the drop cap illustration, what changes? What context? What feeling, right? Not a lot. Obviously, there's visual differences when it's there and when it's not there, but no critical information is lost. So in this particular case, this is the actual code. This doesn't mean necessarily that this is the way that you need to do it for sure, but this is an example of a pattern. So that, again, in this drop cap example, both the ARIA hidden true and it also has an empty null alt image equals alt null. So there's a difference between a missing alt. That means that that alt piece is just gone, right? Whereas this is called a null alt, where it's empty. There's no space in between. Sometimes when I do assessments on pages, people don't understand that whole concept of null alt, and they have actually a space in there. And what it reads to the screen reader is blank. So if you add that extra space in there, that's what the screen reader will hear. And people who have used screen readers for a while will probably figure out, like, okay, there's a space in there that's supposed to be empty and decorative. So in this particular case, they're using both ARIA hidden true and the alt null. You don't need both necessarily, but they're covering their bases. So in this case, this kind of redundancy is not necessary to make it accessible, but it's also not harmful in this particular situation, since the div only contains images we want to hide. If there was anything else inside that div that we wanted to show to our users, it would be hidden. So definitely make sure that when it comes to accessible code, more is not always better. So the big takeaway for decorative images, if you decide your image is decorative, then programmatically the image needs to be hidden. And of course, there are many ways to hide images, including that null alt that I talked about. Another hint there, not to be confused with missing alt. Or by implementing the image as a CSS background or icon font. That's kind of typical. ARIA is another way to do it. So you can add the image role presentation, image role none, or as we saw in that example earlier, the ARIA hidden true. And again, I have that little asterisk there because when ARIA hidden true is an option to hide image, it's cautious when you apply it because it can remove the entire element from the accessibility API. So just like we saw in that div example earlier, you hide everything. And of course, the CSS background. So you could do that as a background image, icon fonts. There's a lot of different ways to make your images decorative. So besides programmatically hiding your image, there's not much more to consider when it comes to decorative images. I kind of call it as it's part art and part skill, right? The skill part is the stuff we just talked about, the knowing when to hide it, how to hide it. The art part is that processing, like, wait, what about X? How about Y? If you're asking questions like that, if you're asking those when you have these images removed, then you may need to go back to the image decision tree tool and like reevaluate your image, because it might not be 100% decorative after all. And I think that's one of the ones that emotional mood kind of based images kind of are in the subtype, right? Those are the ones that are a little bit more subjective. And I've been asked a lot of times, like, how do I know? And I'm like, this is an internal question that you have to ask your team. We have to say, these types of images are decorative. These types of images we want to convey the emotional part or the informative part, right? The key there is consistency. So if you consider one type a decorative, then it should be considered decorative throughout your website. You shouldn't flip-flop when you can. You just want to use your best judgment on those. Moving on from decorative, let's look at informative images. So again, we have an example of an informative image following the DQ logo. So it's the same kind of question. If that logo was to disappear, does the context change? Does the page change? And in this case, the answer is yes. The logo obviously is very important to a website. It's one of the first things that people hear, encounter, see when they go to your website or your app, right? You definitely want to make sure that your logo that information is conveyed. And in this particular case, it is both actionable and informative because it is a link like most logos are. So again, in this case, we have it's a link, it's got an SVG as the image type. And in this particular case, when we inspect the logo, we see that it's utilizing ARIA labeled by and a title plus a screen reader only span tag. So again, maybe a little bit more redundancy than we need to, but I'm showing you actual examples in the wild. So when we fire up in the assistive technology device like a screen reader, we might hear redundancy, we might hear DQ logo. And again, it doesn't matter in that case. Like people ask me about that too. Like, do I need the word logo? It doesn't really matter. I think most people who use screen readers, they know that that's one of the first things that they're going to hear is the logo. There's not really a hard and fast rule. It's all about consistency. It's all about the idea of like, I would rather you be redundant and say something twice than not say it at all. So you kind of think about those kinds of things. A screen reader user, if you're worried about that specifically, they can skip over anything and fast forward basically through your messaging if they think it is being redundant. So for these AT devices to understand the message or intent of an image, informative images must have grammatically discernible alternative text. Typically that's accomplished by using the image alt, some description. In this case, we just have the image alt of info. But there's alternative ways to add image information like we saw in the example, including ARIA and HTML, depending on the subtype. So simple versus complex. So in this case, we have ARIA label info. ARIA label ID, that means that you need to have an ID link to it. So that's a relationship. People always forget about HTML though. You can really literally put it in markup text and it could be visible or not visible. If you're thinking beyond AT devices, if you're thinking beyond screen readers, there's a lot of people with cognitive issues that might need that information, right? So think beyond that. So that was for the IMG tag. For SVGs, it's a little bit different. There are no alts. There's not really a traditional alt for SVGs. One pro tip here too is if you are using SVGs as images and not a data of other kinds, or it's not decorative, it's actually an informative, you want to make sure you add that role of image. And that signals to the AT devices that, hey, this is an image. And then you can add your information in the form of ARIA labels, ARIA labeled by, and of course tags. So SVGs have their own special tags that they can have that other elements don't. So title, text, and description are the key ones. I did write an article on this and went into all the different kinds of patterns and tested it with the AT devices at the time. So if you want that link, let me know. Otherwise, I'm sure you could Google that real quick and find it as well. But it's really interesting to me what some of the combinations of patterns, what they read to some AT devices and browser combos, because not only are you talking about whatever AT device I'm using, let's say I'm using VoiceOver, right? What are my settings? What browser am I using? What are the versions of the things, right? So there's all this kind of complexity that comes into talking and giving alt information to images. But having alternative text is great, of course, but it's not enough. It also must be meaningful. It's a very key word here. For example, if your image is about how you're feeling safe at home, but your alternative information says house, does that convey the full message? For more complex alternative text phrases, I like to conduct the telephone test. So that's what the telephone is. If I called up a friend and I said snail, and I hung up the phone, your friend would probably be confused, but also might think of just a garden snail, but in what context? So it could be a little snail eating a piece of lettuce. It could be like a psychedelic 70s snail, this creepy snail facial, or maybe cartoon Gary snail, right? A snail leaves a lot of room for interpretation. But if I call my friend up and I said, the snail is eating my hydrangeas, that would paint a more vivid picture. And I didn't really add a lot of characters or effort to that, right? Of course, AT users have to listen to your alternative text, so don't go overboard. I don't necessarily have to say, the golden and gray snail, tiny snail, is on my purple hydrangea and is causing me massive headaches. I mean, you could, but you want to cap it around 150 characters. Some people say 250, but the point is that you want it to be descriptive, but not a novel. If you feel like you do need to add that additional context, there are different alternative patterns where you can add those additional details. So you're not at a loss if you want to be more descriptive, or again, HTML, it can be your friend. You could literally have a paragraph right next to this describing what it is, or underneath as an image description. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. All that being said, there is a world beyond image alts. A lot of people stop there, but it's important to note that image alt is important and addresses the needs, especially of screen reader users. So your low vision and blind users for sure. But a lot of people with disabilities don't rely on screen readers and may use other AT tools like browser resizing, customized style sheets, magnification software, to help them see what's on the screen. So to these people, that screen reader output, those alts, probably is not as important to them as other image elements like color, contrast, typography, layout, copy, icons, hence the presentation and all the different options here that we have. So let's look beyond image alts and consider some additional image elements using real world PSA examples. So I created this article. It's a presentation from a original article on Smashing magazine, and I think this one came out in March. So you know, PSAs were first coming out for everything with the COVID-19 pandemic, and as the world was kind of exploding, and so I wanted to make sure that that kind of information was conveyed to people who were using assistive technology devices, because I saw a lot of really bad examples of critical information that needed to get to the masses, but a lot of people with disabilities couldn't access them. Either the alts were just rubbish, or they didn't have them, or the color contrast was bad. So the following parts aren't meant to call people out and say that they're awful, but it's just that we've learned a lot since then, and I have seen improvements. So it is a positive trend in that sense. But this particular one is from the United Nations, and the message from this one is avoid touching your face. So I thought that was kind of fun. This is an image of a hand with pins glued to it backwards. So you would touch the hand, you would get pinned, and that would hurt. So again, not judging the rest of these, but just using them as examples. So the beating heart of design arguably is this color and contrast. And color is the heart, contrast would be the muscle. So without good color contrast levels in place, elements like words, icons, any graphical shapes that are hard to discern, and the design can quickly become inaccessible. But what happens when you perceive color and contrast differently than others? Does this message and intent still come through? How do I reach people with color sensing issues such as color blindness? It's estimated in the world, 300 million people are colorblind. So that's a lot of people and experiences to consider. But color and contrast also affects people with partial sight, older adults, people with certain situations. We've all been in situations like low lighting in a room, or screen glare on a device. So we've all been there. And the number of actual people you reach with accessible color and contrast is much, much higher. So the first review, we're reviewing PSA from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. And then we're also going to be looking at the nonprofit group called the Ad Council. So that is one of the biggest producers of PSAs in the United States. So this is kind of an example. And this is the PSA that kicked it off for me, because this is real. This is like what I really saw on social media and on their websites. These and PSAs are arguably beautiful, right? It's got some interesting color combinations that you don't normally see. It's got some salmon and some teal in there, which is not, again, not normal. Normally colors that you would see in a PSA. So they are eye-catching, but they definitely have some issues when it comes to WCAG guidelines for color contrast ratio. And this is the unedited versions of this. And now I'm applying a color blindness simulator called Chrome Lens Extension. You can get that if you're using Chrome. And this tool includes the Lens Vision Simulator. So what it does is it basically puts on a filter that transforms the colors of a website or a PSA or a PDF or whatever you're looking at, and simulates what a colorblind person might see. Simulators, I have to put a little asterisk there as well, because obviously they're an interpretation of what we think it is to be have this level of color blindness, but it runs the gamut. An individual could run in different directions here. So this is not a hard and fast. This is 100% what a person with this particular color blindness, in this particular case red-green color blindness, would see, but it's an approximation, so we can kind of build that into our tests. So you can see it went from the salmon and the teal to some purple and some really hard to see greens. And this one is also a simulated PSA with red wheat color blindness. So again, you can see the salmon turned to an orange color, the teals turned into this like purpley blue. And this is another simulator that I'm using. This is the No Copy Vision Simulator tool. And it can see, it does a lot of different things. It does the color contrast just like the other one that we just did, but this one also has things like low vision, cataracts. So in this particular case, that's low vision, and this is cataracts. So I went through those quickly, but I'm going to break them down a little bit here. So this is the color contrast ratios found on those PSAs. So again, this is the original. And for large size text, or sorry, regular size text, we want to meet 4.5 to 1. So that's the ratio I'm looking for, that 4.5 to 1. And what that is testing is the text color versus the background color. In this particular case, these are PDFs, so I had to use a tool called the Color Contrast Analyzer. And I love this tool because it can pick from non-coded values. So if you're using designs or comps or anything other than hex on hex, right? Or in the case of if you have a hex color, but it's on a gradient, or hex on top of an image, right? These are places where this would come into play, this kind of tool. It's really awesome. So I can eyedropper and get an approximation of what the text color is and the background. So the first one is sampling the word have, and the second one is sampling the word diabetes. So again, I'm looking for 4.5 to 1 for the regular size text, but that's pretty large. So what I'm actually looking for the large font, so 18 points and larger, or 14 points bold, is a 3 to 1. So either way, 3 to 1, 4.5 to 1, I'm failing. I have 1.26 and 1.86 to 1. So this is the original. This is one with the red-green color blindness simulator applied. So again, this is even worse, 1.07. Sorry, 1.07, yeah, 1.27, they both fail. So again, I'm looking for 3 to 1 on this case. This is the red week, again, apply. You see a trend here is that we're failing. We're failing originally, but we're super failing when it comes to people with color blindness. The salmon one is easy to pick on because you can tell it was probably already gonna have some issues, but I went ahead and looked at the blue one as well. This is actually much worse. This is the original again. You see the first sampling for the word undergoing. So if you might not even be able to see that depending on your what screen you're looking at it, because it's really difficult even for me to see it from where I'm sitting. But that is 1.33 and the other one is 1.99 for the words cancer treatment. So again, failing. This one is the low vision. Can you imagine if you have low vision and you're trying to see this PSA? That information, I might be somebody having cancer treatment. I might have some some issues. I might be older. I might have some issues with the chemotherapy that I'm undergoing, right? I might have some issues with my eyesight. I might have a migraine, right? There's a lot of situations where this could happen for somebody, especially in that targeted group. Similar to that is the cataract. The cataract one is tricky because, again, the field of vision is a variable. So where I sampled might be different from where you sampled. So if you took these slides and ran your own test, you might have slightly different ratios, but you definitely would still fail. So a lot of people blame color for their design accessibility issues, but these last two examples are really showing how contrast plays a role as well. So I didn't change the colors of the PSAs like I did with the color blindness simulators, but by changing that user perspective and blurring out parts of the text, we can see the text of the images are more difficult to read, even though the contrast ratios in some cases didn't really change by much in this example. So to make these PSAs more accessible, we definitely need to increase the contrast on these images so people with color blindness, low vision, and eye disorders could read the text. Some takeaways, because I'm super practical and I want you to be able to do something about this, is review the color contrast ratios. There's a whole gamut of tools and guidelines related to color contrast. This is one of those things in accessibility world that's super easy to get right because there is so much. It is a formula, right? It's not a lot of thought process going in. It's using a tool, testing the ratios, fail or pass. It's pretty simple. So just use those tools. But beyond that, you want to make sure that you keep those solid backgrounds, especially on PSAs and things. So keep those backgrounds simple. You don't need these crazy gradients and patterns and things in the background. And we're pretty good about that these days when it comes to actual content text, but not so much when it comes to things like hero images with lots of text on it, or a slide that comes in with a lot of text to it, right? These can be complex. And I don't mean to stifle your creativity. Definitely please be creative, but obviously there's ways to be creative in a responsible way. Another piece of this is just making sure you don't use color alone for meaning. So related to the color contrast ratios, you don't want to use color as your only meaning, because if you don't see color or you don't see that specific color, how do you know if you can press the green button if you can't see green, right? So don't make it a guessing game for your users. Just definitely make that one part clear. All right, moving on to typography and layout. I could talk about any of these subjects probably at length on its own subjects. I'm trying to go a little bit faster so we can get through all the material, but typography and layout, in a perfect world, we keep our text and images separated, but we don't live in that kind of world. But this would allow users to manipulate the typography, the layout. It could change the font size, letter spacing, kerning, justification, margins, padding, so much more. But unfortunately, there are a lot of formats that this kind of separation is difficult or impossible. Social media posts, of course, emails, PDFs, any sort of fixed form media. So this is where we have to make the responsible choices. Typography and layout can affect a lot of different people, including people with dyslexia. We estimate about 15 to 20% of the world's population has dyslexia. So that's a learning disorder where certain letters or numbers or combinations of letters can be confusing or pushed together. They can flip and move around. So people with low vision, attention deficit disorders, reading disabilities, a complex layout is also a real barrier to them. These users have trouble keeping their place and following the flow of the content due to the lack of white space and clear linear pathways. So again, we're making these choices for them, especially on these mixed media or these fixed media situations like these PSAs that often come in PDF form. So here we go at PSA of California Long Beach Human and Health Services. And again, from a PSA, from an accessibility point of view, and focusing more on typography and layout because there might be multiple issues beyond that. These are the things that stand out for me. The first thing I'm showing are these hand-drawn lines, red hand-drawn lines, and these are illustrating multiple rivers of space, or rivers of light, I've heard them called. So basically, there are these these spaces within the content that a person who has attention deficit disorder could skip through or jump through or might be confused on where they are because of the layout. So literally just unjustifying them and floating them to the left, the text alignment could prevent that issue. The blue dotted boxes, you'll see this in the next few examples. These outline different layout changes. So if you, again, if you look at this PSA in the form of like, this is a website, right? You can see which are the header, what's the footer, you know, what are the subsections, right? So these are patterns that are repeated over and over again. You can see that we've got 6 different layouts on this one. The peak numbers, they highlight 14 different typography treatments that are discovered, ignoring the logo because the logo is exempt. So some of these are like font family changes, color changes. Some are a little more subtle, like alignment or size or weight changes. But overall, we have 14. The green question marks, I added those in. Those are bonus because what does this equation even mean? How do I read this? Cognitively, this is a very difficult thing for me to understand. As a person without cognitive disability, I can't even imagine what this would do to somebody who has that disability. So definitely, it's just really odd to me. And the last one are the black lines and dots. So this is the expected 12 points of visual interest if I did a UX eye tracking test based on the ordered content. So in English speaking sites, we go top to bottom, left to right, right? And so we're kind of, again, it's similar to like a heat map that you would see if somebody was looking through, or tab stops even. So you're kind of looking through the page and how would people go? And you can see this layout is rather complex. Here's all of the fun together. Overwhelm you. A similar one, Health Department of Prince George County in Maryland. This time we have 9 different layout changes. Again, we can see some consistencies within those layout changes, but specifically they're all different. We have, let's see, 11 different typography treatments in this particular one. So a little bit less, that's hard to see. There's number 11 right there. And this one is a little bit more straightforward, but still we're zigzagging across the page to get all the information. So it's not the most efficient way to get all the information that I need to get, especially when it kind of goes backwards a little bit here. Like when we go backwards, it's a little odd. Here's with all of them. And then last but not least, I showed you 2 examples of ones that maybe could be modified. And this one's a little bit more straightforward. This is from Prevention Action Alliance out of Columbus, Ohio. So similar treatment here. If we look at the layouts, we only have 3, right? And that, you know, one could argue even the logos could be exempt from the bottom, but we only have 3 treatment types. As far as the typography changes, in this case, we only have 4. And again, this one, maybe you could argue at the bottom, could be part of that logo system, but there are only 4 changes here. So much more simple. And obviously it's much linear, it's top to bottom. So I'm not jumping all over the page, I'm not zigzagging, I don't have really odd equations that are going on to figure out this information. It's very straightforward, it's clean. I feel like overall the design just feels better too to me. It just, but that's my preference. Obviously, it's a little more clean. What I like when it comes to getting information. So as you might have guessed, less is more when it comes to accessibility and accessible typography. So limit the number of different font families and variations, such as like italic, bold, all caps. You don't need all of those variations for people to get that information. Again, this is focusing on PSAs and images, but that could be applicable really to any web content that you have. We want to make sure research is not super conclusive whether serif or sans serif typefaces are easier to read overall. But what we really want you to do is make sure that you pick fonts with clear letter shapes. So things like the I, the capital I in India, the lowercase l like in lettuce, or the number 1. If you look at some fonts, those all look exactly the same. And I think we've all been in situations where we get a password and we're supposed to type it in or something, and you're like, is that a 1? Is that an I? Is that an L? Like, what is that? So very similar kind of situation, especially people with dyslexia who often flip letters and they want them to be distinct. So B's and D's, P's and Q's, like anything that you think, you put them in a mirror, and if I flipped it, is it the mirror opposite, or does it distinctive enough to be different from that mirror flip? The letter B and the letter 8 also are ones that we look at a lot. When we talk about layout specifically, we definitely want to pay attention to spacing and alignment. Less is also more when it comes to layout. So we saw those rivers of space. We saw some odd line spacing and paragraph spacing. So there are specific guidelines when it comes to accessible spacing and alignment. So go ahead and take a look at those on WCAG guidelines. All right, just checking on the time. All right, still going. All right, so last but not least, let's focus on the PSA message. Copy is a key element about informing public of latest updates and providing information about preventing the spread of the virus when it comes to accessibility. But people with attention deficit disorders, which we estimate about 129 million people worldwide, they do have issues focusing on copy that is too long, just big blocks of text. They need things to be broken into lists. They need white space. They need a lot more room to breathe. Obviously, it affects more people than just people with attention disorders, people with cognitive issues, language, learning disabilities. They need these additional icons and graphics to help understand the copy. So I'll go through this one a little bit fast. So one way that we can do that is to check the readability. So these are both from the CDC, and they actually have very similar information. You can see the one on the left has a lot more text, and the one on the right has a few more graphics involved. If I go through a tool like the Readable tool or the readability test, we see the PSA with a lot more text has 388 words and a reading grade level of 9 on the Fleisch-Kincaid reading scale, at 64.6 for the reading ease. So in addition to these metrics for accessibility, we also want to look at the number of complex words and their frequency. So in this case, we have 35 complex words at a 9% percentage of frequency. So just a side note that that reading ease level is out of 100. So the lower the number, the more difficult the copy is to read. So for reference, we want to aim around 60 to 70. So this is in that range. So it definitely does pass both the grade level and the ease level. So that's good, but we can make it easier, right? It is adequate, the first image. It falls in suggested readability ranges for web-based copy, but let's compare it to this one, which has more imagery involved. If we evaluate the main copy, we see that our copy now has 90 words and an average grade level of 6 and an ease level of 83.6. So that goes closer to 100, it's better. So the number of complex words now is down to 4 and only the frequency of 4% throughout. So compared with the first PSA, this PSA has 298 fewer words. It's easier to read by 3 grade levels, has a reading ease level increase of 19 points. And overall, I mean, it's just less complex. So based on these numbers, we can extrapolate the second PSA is more inclusive versus the first if you're looking at just copy. This is my favorite part, so I'll get through. I know she's going to come on and tell me I have like 2 minutes left, but I'll read this one real quick. Testing the readability isn't the only way to measure effectiveness of PSAs. So another one is icons. So I do this test. I did this with coworkers, and I asked them, what do these icons represent, right? And some of them had trouble understanding. This is from the European Cyclist Federation. And they could guess on a few of them, but there are other ones like checking your bicycle before you start pedaling,